Thank you everybody for coming, and thank you to the New York organizers for putting this together. I'm really looking forward to all the talks that are going to happen today. I think there's a really good lineup. So as Zarar mentioned, I'm going to talk to you about gender hierarchies in Islam, but I do want to preface the talk with a few things. So it's a very delicate conversation. So I just want to say a few things just to frame this talk and kind of let you know the reason why I'm talking about this issue. So starting with this quote by Majid Nawaz, where he says that in an open society, no idea should be above scrutiny, just as no people should be beneath dignity. And this is something that Ibrahim touched on, so I won't dwell on it. But I think that in order for us to progress, we have to really be able to criticize ideas. And we can do that without dehumanizing people. So these conversations, when we try to have these conversations, these very difficult conversations in the West, what happens is that the conversation gets hijacked and really ground to dust between the mortar and pestle that is Western social liberals and Western social conservatives. Because conservatives take our narrative and push anti-Muslim bigotry, push their own narrative, and liberals take us or mistake us for anti-Muslim bigots. So I think we really need to clarify that what we're doing here is we're talking about ideas. We're not criticizing people. And the reason that we want to do this is because, of course, we as people who, so for example, for me and other members of Muslimish, we have we're deeply invested in the well-being of Muslim women. We have Muslim Muslim sisters, Muslim mothers, Muslim friends and daughters, and some of us are Muslims ourselves. So there's no one who cares more about the well-being of Muslim women than we do. So we really need to have this conversation in order for us to face our problems. And the first step in solving our problems is facing our problems. So as Zarar mentioned, I am a scientist, but I'm not I don't produce any social science work. I'm a chemist, so I don't produce any of the work that I'm going to be talking about today, but I just have an interest in gender equality and equity. And so one thing that I was interested in, and one thing I've been keeping track of over the years is global gender gaps. So one of the most respected reports is this Global Gender Gap Report by World Economic Forum, and this is the latest one from 2018. And this report is very comprehensive. It looks at 149 countries. It varies slightly from year to year. But what they do is they measure gender disparity based on 4 parameters, which is our economic participation, educational attainment, political empowerment, and health and survival of men versus women. So, of course, I frame everything from a scientific perspective because that's how I look at things. So, in this report, countries are given a scale from 0 to 1, with 1 being parity. And so, this is the summary of the report, where the countries are listed here, where based on the gender gap. And at the top is At the top is the smallest gender gap, here in this case Iceland, and at the bottom the largest gender gap, which is Yemen in this case. So what I've done over the years, this is the same report again, I'm just blowing it up so you can see it better. Now the largest gender gap is over here and the smallest is over here, and then this thick line over here is for the global population weighted average. So I'm going to point out all the countries that are Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, and I'm breaking them down by the involvement of religion in government. So there are only a couple of countries that that are Muslim majority but don't have a specific declaration about Islam. Then here in blue I'm showing the secular Muslim majority countries. So there's separation between government and religion. And then here I'm showing the Islamic countries where Islam is a state religion. And then finally there are 5 countries which are actual Islamic states, so they follow Sharia law. And these are 5 of 6 countries that are in existence. So in case, just going to repeat. Sorry. So in case you missed it, the countries where our Islamic states all fall right here. So when I look at data like this, it's definitely, I see a pattern where there's clustering of the Muslim majority countries towards the larger gender gaps. And because these are countries from different continents, they have different languages spoken there, the thing that's really uniting them is their religion. So if we look at the stats from this report, they're just very disturbing. So 84% of the Muslim majority countries in this report fall below the global average. 60% of the Muslim majority countries in the survey fall in the bottom 17% of ranks. The 5 countries with the highest gender gap are all Muslim majority countries, and 14 of the 15 countries with the highest gender gaps are all Muslim majority countries. So this is clearly indicative of a huge problem. And I think we really need to look at what in Islam, because I think Islam is uniting, or it's not uniting, Islam is the common thing amongst all these countries. So what is it about Islam that leads to this? So a few things we can agree on is that the Quran is the word of God, and Muslims follow the Quran. I don't think there's any dispute in that, but there's some survey data that confirms this. So, and we also know that for the majority of Muslims across many different countries, Islam is very important to them. So this survey just shows the percent of individuals that say religion is very important in their lives. Okay, so given all this, there are Quranic verses that are problematic in terms of establishing women as second-class citizens. There are a few of them, but I think today I'm only going to talk about 2. One which talks about the testimony, the value of testimony of women versus men, and then one talks about the hierarchy of women within a marriage. So this first verse, which is in chapter 2, it's verse 282. It's a pretty lengthy one. So this is the Arabic version over here, and then this is the English version translated with Sahih International Translation, which is, I think, the most widely accepted translation. And I'm just highlighting the text that I find problematic, or the key text. So it says that, and bring to witness 2 witnesses from among your men, and if there are not 2 men available, then a man and 2 women from whom you accept as witness, so that if one of the women errs, the other can remind her. And there have been, so I think it's clearly a problem, because it shows you or tells you that one woman's testimony is not the equivalent of one man's. You need 2 women. And there's a hadith that goes along with this that's much more disturbing, and it's been used, it's cited a lot to explain, to show that women are less intelligent or less valuable than men. The second verse is from chapter 4, verse 34. And I think this one is probably the most problematic in the Quran, and it's usually referred to as the wife-beating verse. It goes, men are in charge of women by right of what Allah has given one over the other, and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. So righteous women are devoutly obedient, guarding in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them. But if they obey you once more, seek no means against them. Indeed, Allah is ever exultant and grand. And so I think this verse, it's so problematic. And if you go to the literature, you'll see a lot of scholars and a lot of imams trying to justify this, or justify or explain or soften the blow of this verse. So some of the common things that are said about this verse is that the corporal punishment should be light. It should be done with a small object, no larger than a toothbrush. I think this is one that a lot of people say. And somebody even recently, I said, or this was a woman, that she said that it wouldn't even be considered domestic abuse in the U.S. Another thing that people say often is that the Prophet was uneasy about this verse and he didn't implement it with his own wives. And there's a lot of scholars that I think mostly this explanation is given by scholars that don't have that Arabic is not their native language. They dispute the meaning of اضربوهن, which is the word that means to strike. But I think for most Arabic speakers, the meaning of this is very clear. But anyway, regardless of how this verse is explained away, I think it's very clear that it establishes a hierarchy. It gives it puts men in charge of women, and I think that's obviously very problematic. And what I find even most disturbing is that a lot of women, especially who say that they are Muslim, don't even know the extent, like the wording of this verse exactly. So I think this is one of the reasons why I want to talk about this. So I think there are a few things that we need to do in order for us to first face this problem, and then we can address it. We really can't delude ourselves into thinking that these verses are not interpreted in the way, in exactly the way that make women second-class citizens. Because the reality is they really, really are. If we look at surveys that, so for instance, this is a survey from the Pew Research Center. It asks, I don't remember how many people, but it's in thousands, tens of thousands of people across different countries about Islam and how Islam is interpreted. And the majority of people agree that there's only one way to interpret Islam. So this manifests itself in many ways. The interpretation of those verses that are that place women as second-class citizens. For example, I showed you the global gender gaps, but there are also other studies where this is very evident. So one study, which is by Alexander and co-workers, they looked at 130,000 individuals from 83 different societies, and they surveyed them on how much they agree with statements like this. So for example, university education is more important for a boy than a girl. And based on their answer, they established this patriarchy score. So the higher the score, the higher that patriarchal values are held. And so in this graph here, on the x-axis is the patriarchal values score. And then here it is broken down by religion. And these highest three are all views of Muslims. So Muslims hold higher patriarchal values than do other religions. And in a similar way, this is another Pew survey. So they grouped two questions together, but one of the questions was a wife must obey her husband, and they looked at how Muslims across the world agree or disagree with this. And the majority of Muslims that are not in Europe agree. So more than 70% of Muslims agree that a woman should obey her husband, or a wife should obey her husband. Another thing that I want to point out is that this is not just these prejudices, I guess, manifest themselves not just on an individual, on a societal level, but also on an individual level. So in this study again by Alexander and co-workers, they're now showing that the patriarchy score for Muslims and non-Muslims based on if they're in a non-Muslim or Muslim majority society. So this is here you can see that for, I don't know if you can see actually, but this is Muslims in a Muslim society, and this is non-Muslims in a Muslim society. So Muslims in a Muslim society have higher patriarchal score versus non-Muslims in the same Muslim societies. So this kind of shows you that Muslims in general have stronger patriarchal tendencies. But if you look at Muslims in non-Muslim societies, they also hold higher patriarchal values than non-Muslims in non-Muslim societies. So this manifests itself both at an individual and a societal level. So this is comparing Muslims in a Muslim society and Muslims in a non-Muslim society. The score is always higher. And the same is true if we compare Muslims versus non-Muslims. So another study that I want to show you is this one, in which about 20,000 people from 15 different countries were asked about whether or not they support gender equality. And so this is the data that was collected and is broken down by men versus women. And this is the 50% of the population line. And so you can see that for the majority of countries, less than half the population, regardless if it's women or men, don't believe that women should be equal to men. If this doesn't disturb you, then I think maybe you're not seeing the implication of this data, because this is exactly what brainwashing looks like when women don't think they should be equal to men. Another thing that I want to say is that this is a similar kind of survey in which participants, Muslims, were asked. For example, this question is, when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. And across Muslim countries, 77% of the on average, 77% of the population agree that men should have a priority for jobs. 75% of the population agree that men make better political leaders. And then 71% agree that a wife must always obey her husband. So I think these are all indicative that women are viewed as second-class citizens. So we really need to. I think it clearly shows that the verses are being interpreted in a way that makes women second-class citizens. So we really can't deny that. We also just can't compare the status of women in Muslim majority countries to those of Muslims in Muslim minority countries. Because data has shown that even though U.S. Muslims, for example, and Muslims worldwide believe in one God and one prophet, when we go to other aspects of religion, for example, if Quran should be read literally word for word, only 50% of U.S. Muslims agree with that statement, while in this case there was only data from sub-Saharan Africa. 80% think that the Quran should be read word for word. And then if we also look at the interpretation of Islam, globally, Muslims, 63% of Muslims think that there's only one way to interpret Islam, while only 37% of U.S. Muslims think that. And there are other data that indicate that the view of Muslims in Muslim minority countries are very different from those in Muslim majority countries. So this is the survey that I showed you earlier. So when it comes to the question of whether when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to jobs than women, 77% worldwide, while only 10% of U.S. Muslims agree with that statement. And then university education being more important for boys versus girls, 75% of Muslims worldwide agree, but only 22% of Muslims in the U.S. agree with that. So the viewpoints of Muslims in the U.S. and worldwide are very different. So we can't really compare them. And then we can't really look at just only one aspect of gender equality. A lot of studies, especially in the West, look at only education. And so you see a lot of articles like this one that say that gender equality in schools in Muslim countries is better than those in the U.S., and some even claim that there's something for us to learn from Muslim majority countries in terms of girls in science and mathematics. But the reality is there's this phenomenon called the gender equality paradox in STEM, so STEM being science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, where there is a negative correlation between the number of women who graduate from STEM fields versus the gender gap. So the higher the gender gap, the more, so this is actually the opposite. More gender equality here leads to lower numbers of women graduating from STEM fields, while when there's a higher gender gap, there are more women that graduate from STEM field. So this has been explained. Sorry, I'll just go back for a second. This has been explained to having to do with freedom of choice. So women in gender equal countries are more likely to pursue careers just out of their interests or passion rather than for financial freedom or security. So, because this conversation is so difficult to have, and because we tend to avoid this conversation, we really don't have a lot of studies that focus on the psychology of women, of Muslim women, and we really need to explore that. We really need more scientific studies that focus on the psychology of Muslim women. The studies that exist right now are quite disturbing, in my opinion. Where women really see, so for instance, in this study from Indonesia, I think, women say that the husbands are the key to paradise. So this is why they obey them and kind of cater to them. And the other studies are equally as disturbing. So I think we really need more data on women, their perception, and I'm sure there's a lot that we're really not understanding because we don't have the data. So this is pretty much all I have to say. I think we can't really just ignore these issues. I think a lot of us, I shouldn't say us, but a lot of people, a lot of Muslim people, I mean, I think I was one of them, kind of just delude ourselves into thinking that these problems don't exist. We just kind of go into denial because it's very comfortable. But I think we really just can't do that. So that's my message, and that's all I have to say. So thank you for listening.